Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, and then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Sheryl, Daughety, and we're looking at a passage from Romans chapter 2. One of the things that we miss sometimes when we read scripture in the New Testament is the Jew is as in bad a shape as the Gentile. We talked yesterday about Paul was writing with a Jewish audience specifically in mind, and he's pushing toward the point, which will become clear in the next chapter, that every single person needs salvation. So we can call the Jewish people God's chosen people, and we believe that, but they still needed salvation. So his first objective here is to convince the Jewish people that they need salvation as much as the Gentiles do. The Jewish people in Paul's day tended to justify themselves based on two principles. One, their ancestry to Abraham. So the logic is that God chose Abraham, made a covenant with him and his descendants, and so they're included. They're born with that right, and they're born right with God. They see themselves, or at least chosen by God. That's what I should say. And their keeping of the law was the second way that they believed they were justified. When they keep the law, they believe they're qualified to be accepted by God. So Romans 2 is framed by verses 18 through 32 on one side, and then Romans 3 and 1 on the other. And it lays out this typical Jewish perspective that the Gentile lifestyle is repulsive. Romans 3 and 1 lays out that the Jewish privilege has been undermined. So Paul makes this argument. First, he argues that when a Jew does the same things that the Gentiles do, it's foolish for them to assume that they will avoid God's judgment just because they're Jewish, descended from Abraham. Verse 11 states outright that God does not show favoritism between the Jews and the Gentiles. Paul's logic here is inarguable. If the Gentiles have never had God's law, yet will be destroyed when they sin, then it is reasonable to assume that the Jews who have received God's law would also be destroyed when they sin against the law. His point is brought into this sharpest focus when he speaks about circumcision in verse 25 through 27, which is so much the mark of a Jew that the Jews as a whole can be called simply the circumcision. That's interesting when you think about that they can simply be called the circumcision, and they often are. If this outward ethnic identity marker does not create favor in the sight of God, especially when the Jews break the law in spite of being circumcised, then neither ethnicity nor the covenant of the law can give the Jewish person a leg up concerning the need to be saved. So, a couple of things here, sure. One, we tend to read through church eyes or Christian eyes when we read the Bible, and we certainly read it through a historical perspective. And we fail to see this as a discussion about privilege, maybe even racial privilege, if you think about it. So how does that perspective change the way you think about and feel about Paul's argument? When you think about the Jews believe they had this racial superiority over everybody else, which has been one of the arguments against them, right? That was one of Hitler's arguments. It was a racially motivated thing. So how does it change when you read Paul's argument that the Jews and the Gentiles are alike? How does it change your perspective?
Well, I'm sure it was extremely challenging for them, even to the point that obviously some people were just repulsed by it altogether, because this was a new way of thinking for them. But I also love that Paul's argument, just as Jesus's was the great equalizer for them. Because I think he does a very good job here of laying out, like, if you know this law and you're breaking the law, if you think that they're going to be punished for it, then what makes you think that they wouldn't be? Like, how
Right.
can you think that something as insignificant when you're talking about salvation as your birth or circumcision, something outward, is going to make the difference between you being saved and them not? I love the fact that he's saying it doesn't matter what family you're born into, what race you're born into, it doesn't matter what social status you have, it doesn't matter what your parents believed, that everybody has equal access to Jesus and everybody has that equal access to salvation. But I can certainly see how it would have been a very hard pill for the Jews to swallow because that's not what they had been being taught for generations before
Correct.
that.
Yeah, we are somebody. Why do we need this?
Right.
You know? Do people born into a Christian culture have some of those same problems about being saved? Do we have some of those same issues where we're we think, well, they need it, I don't.
That's so nuanced, isn't it? Because I think that first, one of the things that you hear people say who want nothing to do with Christianity is that they know so many Christians that are holier than thou and that they think they stand up on some special platform that nobody else.
Or they're hypocritical.
Yes, or they're hypocritical. Both. I mean, both of those things really are kind of the same if you think about it. I think that that's a dangerous place to be. And I also think that if we truly are Christians who have a true relationship with Christ, I don't know how we can look at ourselves and not still see the sin that we struggle with every day. So I think we had to be honest with ourselves about that. But then I also do think, and we've talked about this a lot, it's really easy for us to stand on a soapbox about a sin that we don't struggle with. Because, and I see that happen more frequently than either of the other two things. I feel that you see people stand on this one thing that they're willing to die on, and it's something that they've never struggled with. It's easy for me to say to an alcoholic, just put the stupid alcohol down. It's ruining your life. When I've never had a problem with alcohol, I can't relate to that. But it would be easy for me to think that I could tell somebody else how to deal with it so easily. And that would be something I would stand on and say, this is a sin you shouldn't struggle with.
Right.
But it wouldn't be so easy for me to say that to somebody about a sin that I do struggle with. I think I'd have more sympathy and empathy for somebody who's struggling with that because I've experienced it.
I think we typically do.
Yeah.
You know, I notice people who have gone through things and they're either extremely harsh about it or they're extremely merciful about it.
You mean to other people?
To other people. The ones I think that are toughest is because we don't have any concept of it. You know, homosexuality. Can I relate? No. I don't.
Yeah.
I it's never crossed my mind. Right? You know, so I don't even understand. But drugs, alcohol, no. Like I cannot imagine that becoming a vice. But I can think of other things in my life that have become a vice. And one of the turnoffs that we have in the world, it's not that the world doesn't expect perfection from us. It's that we expect perfection from them.
That's right.
Right? And that's the challenge. We expect perfection from them, and so they don't know how to. They think we're hypocrite. Well, you're being hypocritical about this, you know.
And you are. If you're expecting them to be perfect, then you can't be.
I've walked through a couple of situations with people recently and tried. They were like, you know, you're so open about, you know, what happened in your life. Well, what other choice do I have? Right? I mean, it just seems hypocritical to not be. It's like, well, at this point it's really recent, but by the time you listen to this, it'll be a month and a half at least. I preached a horrible sermon in one service. Like it was atrocious. And I knew it. I knew it while I was in the middle of it and couldn't stop it. Right?
It's a train wreck and you couldn't stop it. I
couldn't stop it. The next service I was able to correct it. Right? This is the beauty of having two services. But the next Sunday, I said, look, that sermon last Sunday was horrible. And somebody came to me and said, you didn't have to do that. No, I didn't. But I think the people in the pew appreciate the fact that I can say,
Right.
you know, some days I crush it and some days I get crushed, right? Because that happens on their job, right? Some days they show up and they're killing it. Other days they're not.
Parenting, that's another great example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some days you feel like, man, I aced that, and some days that sucked. And the same is true in our walk with Christ. And being authentic is one of the greatest. As a matter of fact, that is the word of the year for Google. It's the number one searched word
Authentic.
on Google right now, like by a long shot. People want some authenticity, and the Jews were not authentic. They're over here killing Jesus for no reason. And then they're telling people, don't murder.
Live a blameless life.
Right.
Reading these things and thinking through it all made me think of a passage that Paul had written in Ephesians, where he is speaking to people where they are. He's speaking to the slave when he says to him, even in the position that you're in right now, you have to choose to serve God and to do everything that you're doing to the best of your ability. And then he says the same thing to the master of that slave. And I love the fact that, excuse me, this great equalizer that he's bringing in is not, we were talking about Jewish people and talking about racial superiority. I love the fact that he, again, like Jesus, is not talking about racial justice. He's talking about the heart. And he is appealing to each of us in the situation that we're currently in, not the one we want to be in, but the one that we're in now. And I love that he knows, like, you can change this social situation, but if you're not working in people's hearts, the change is not going to last.
Right.
It's going to be more like the law that existed, because these are rules that we follow. But if we're willing to look in our hearts and we're willing to change that part, then we do have lasting change in our lives and in turn in the lives of others.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. I hope you'll be back with us next week as we continue our conversation around our daily Bible reading.